Okay, so in today's tutorial, I would like to discuss noise in Octane and procedural textures in general. You can see I have a scene set up here, which we will be working in today, only set up within a few minutes, and I have created a little noise texture, and you can see the kind of fidelity here in this noise. And what I want to discuss is how we can utilize noise as a FAO interpretation of real bitmap textures. Now, thankfully, we have enough memory and scene storage in this era that we can get away with very high quality bitmap textures, but sometimes they can slow you down immensely. And a few of the benefits to using noise textures is that you have the advantage of low storage cost. We have unlimited texture resolution. No matter how much we zoom into this noise, no pixelation will happen. Absolutely none. And, if you're on a lower end rig, that can be perfect for you. And not only that, noise was actually created to give you natural looking textures. So using it for that is an absolute smart move to do. There's no memory or bandwidth requirements. You've got no UV mapping issues. And of course, you can do a very wide variety of effects, and we're going to be using them all today with this texturing primitive. Now, I did look into this a lot, and my resources for this came from Ken Perlin, who created the Perlin noise. He made a SIGGRAPH paper called An Image Synthesizer in 1985, and I will link that resource below. So if you really want to dive into the history of noise, you can go and look that up and learn everything about noise, and of course how it works in 3D space and 2D space. But today we're just going to be focused on using it as a substitute for textures and why it's going to speed our scenes up. Before the tutorial starts, I want you to consider other methods of learning and expanding your skills, which you can do with the sponsor of this video, Skillshare. And I find it hard to believe that you've not heard of Skillshare. Of course, being an online learning platform with an abundance of classes, you can perpetually expand any skill in your workflow. And there's a saying in that which people question how significant figures in history achieved so much with only 2 years of formal education, yet in all cases, they achieved what they did because they only had 2 years of formal education. In Skillshare, you can learn what you want to learn for yourself and for your purpose. And you will see courses there all about 3D and Cinema 4D and other coinciding software. There's some really good courses by Studio JQ. And personally, on Skillshare, I've been watching Ali Abdal's Productivity Masterclass, as I'm always just obsessed with being that little bit more efficient. And there's no fabrication here. Skillshare has no ads. And with a $10 a month annual subscription, the reinvestment is resolute to your growth as an artist. And the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. So good luck on learning, and now let's do a deep dive on that noise. Okay, so I will show you a couple of different examples of where we can use noise. I wish I could have a very kind of defined and prior goal with showing you exactly where you can use noise, but there's going to be a lot of liberation in this tutorial. And once you find and discover how to use noise, you can then branch out and know exactly when to use that. And it's very possible that if you have been watching a lot of my tutorials, you've picked up on the method of using it to create immediate detail, and you don't really understand it. And understanding it on that whole other level is going to be really where you can dive into it. So if we look at this texture here, you're going to see it's relatively simple. If this does overwhelm you, don't let it. Just as an example of how disposable this is, I'll get rid of it and we'll do it again. So if we plug the noise into the bump, you can use the normal. It will take tweaking the noise in a different manner, but you will still get the same result in the end. Of course, if you don't know the difference, normal is faking the detail and the geometry, and the bump is actually doing it. So we'll put in our projection nodes and we'll just set it to box for now, and I'm going for detail with this first setup, so I'm just going to bring down the scale, and just like that you can see my result is mirroring what I just had. Now of course what I just had before is I had messed with the roughness as well, because using this in the roughness in conjunction with the bump, it's then like you have, of course, a roughness map, a bump map. You can duplicate it, use the same transform and texture projection, and you can see this is a lot shinier now. And you can start making different diffuse examples. Of course, I will show you that. I'll plug this in the diffuse. Maybe I want a nice bridge between black and white, like your typical noise that you see. You can maybe make it red. And the possibilities are truly endless with this. So we'll delete that. Now, what we can do here is I'm going to explain the way the gamma and the contrast work. So you've got your gamma here. Now, there's kind of a point in the middle of your gamma where the noise is going to kind of get at its thickest. Bumping it all the way up to 100 or all the way down to 0 most of the time will give you next to the same effect. You can see if I plug that, if I take the roughness off there, between 100 and 0, it's the same thing. So kind of finding the height of the curve before it diminishes, then you're going to get some nice effects there. Now, of course, contrast will do what it says. It will give you more contrast amongst the texture. And of course, this is a lot more control than typical bitmap textures can give us. You might want a crocodile leather texture, and we can very quickly gain that. You switch it to turbulence, you bring down the octaves and the omega, you find the height of that curve, and you've got something that looks like leather. This maybe looks a little bit pebble-like, but I assure you it's not far off. The touchability and the realness to this is very exceptional, and I use it in nearly all of my renders. And we can use this as surface imperfections, we can use this in the rotation to get it on the reflections as well. So I'm maybe going to plug this roughness back in here. You can see the nice kind of sparkles we've got from this. I think I'll let that be. Now, with the effect we've got right now, due to the way the gradient is sitting, and you can even add a second controller for the roughness, and the way you would do that is duplicate this like we did for the diffuse, but use the same transform nodes. And now we can alter this, and you can see that as I bump this gamma up, in between at the lowest point where the surface is not being raised, it seems to get more glossy and reflective. So you can use this to create things like puddles. So I will leave this something like this now, maybe, and just bring up our octaves and our omega a little bit. I'm just going to leave that as a functional noise, and we'll call this, I'm just going to number them, we'll call it 1, and now we're going to go to 2, and we'll call this 1. I'm going to pop out here, and we'll call this 2 in a second. I might have to make this smaller, but we'll call this 1 2, and we shall pop number 2 on there. So with number 2, I'm going to stay out here, and you can see at a distance it does look a little bit grainy right now, so to solve that I'll probably just bring up the scale, not that much, but a little bit. Maybe just push this back to Perlin just so we can kind of see the detail more. Now the look I'm going to go for this, I'm going to take that out of the bump, but we will switch this back to Perlin. I'll duplicate the camera and I'll just zoom in here so we can get a look at him. Now let's bring up our scale. If you solo this, you're going to get a look at your scale here. You can see if we bring up our octaves and then follow with the omega, everything's going to get more detailed, much more detailed. And if you don't like this seam here, and it's the sphere, not the noise, you can just switch that back to mesh UV and then readjust the scale to something similar. You may have to unplug and strain it up, but back to the omega, like I said, you can see the kind of fidelity here. Now if we are to unsolo that. You can see that this can be used as a substitute for a surface imperfection. And this is definitely something I use a lot. And if you get the detail to a high level and then mess with a gradient, you're definitely gonna get something that looks good. Maybe a little bit patchy right now, but I think that looks pretty good. And certainly at a distance, it's not that much different to a normal surface imperfection. If you're really going for realism up close, of course, if you do have the ability to sustain a high resolution texture, which 90% of you most likely do, that is the way to go, because you're going to get scratches. Now we can create a flowchart of noises in the node editor that provide different patterns and combine them into one that would make one kind of realistic surface imperfection. Just using a standard purlin, I think it is good if you have surfaces at a distance that are using surface imperfections that you want to release some of the stress for scene optimization. Is definitely a way to go with that. Also, if you're just setting up a scene quickly and you need to throw a surface imperfection into action, again, that can be a good use for that. And you can invert it. Not going to change much, but it certainly does it. And you can just see playing with that there what that does. And you could play with that for a long time. You can even see there, the more you bring in the octaves and omega and balance that out, is the more realistic it gets. And if you were to hypothetically mix it with this, you may want to use, you can see the overall size of this here. I mean, you can still, that still looks good. Maybe you can find a use out of that, but we are to bring that back down, and now we have a mix between that and that. Looks very puddle-like. Looks pretty cool. Now we will move on to a third one. So I will take these, I'll make them maybe about 80, and I'll take the third guy. And we'll come over to him. 3. Now creating something a little bit more abstract. If we are to switch to, for example, chips, and you can see here, as we bring down those octaves, you can see the kind of cellular type chip texturing that's going on. Now if we bring those octaves up, you can kind of see what's going on there, and mess with the omega, you can very quickly go from such little detail to infinite detail. And mess with the gamma, you can kind of see the kind of cracked texture that you're achieving. Very world-like, very concrete, like, and you can emulate realistic world textures indefinitely. And if you were to mix that again with your gamma and contrast, and you're getting what could pass for a real life texture. Now again, duplicate it, and this time what we're going to do is we're going to get a gradient and put that into the diffuse, and we're going to mix it just between a black and a grey. Maybe make him a little bit darker. Maybe make this guy a little bit lighter. And you can see now we've eased up out of that black. The concrete is kind of more prominent. And you can just keep playing with that. There's only so much I can show you here, but you get the idea. And if you were to come back to the gamma here, you can very quickly change this into something completely different. Bump up the octaves, bring down the omega, and your result is different. Now, if I'm to come back to the front camera here, you can see that that's 3 completely different uses. You've got a simple texture which you could apply to something like a keyboard or product. You've got surface imperfection, and you've got a grind texture. And that's all with the same node, and that's all created in under 10 minutes. So the sheer possibilities that you can take with this are endless, and I do highly recommend that you look up Ken Perlin's initial work on noise and why he made them. Of course, the uses for noise completely exceed textures. These are primitives that exist in 3D space, and you see that with things like the random field and volume builder in Cinema 4D. And funnily enough, the reason he actually made these textures was when he was working on the Tron movie all the way back in '85, and he was very impressed with the fact that the studio didn't actually use polygons. They used they modeled everything with primitive objects and Boolean operations, and the fact that that was saving them so much memory at the time inspired him to think, okay, we can do this with textures too, which led him down the path to create what is still being used today 40 years later on a much deeper scale. And of course there's a lot of use for this, and I think you can get some very, very good results out of it, and using it for things like fabric and tweaking it enough so you get slightly more geometric patterns that look like weaves, and it's definitely a good tool to have in your workflow to know, okay, I could turn to noise and get this result if I needed to. I don't need to rely on the scene outsourcing different assets that's making the scene file huge. And also, if you're working with a 3D artists in studio and you're passing files around a lot, again, this can be a huge time and space saver. So I thought I would make a couple different more concentrated segments here with a much more defined objective to seeing where you can fit utilizing noise into your workflow. Now, of course, I've discussed at other points in this tutorial that using noise is, because it's all mathematically generated, your scene sizes are going to be smaller, your RAM usage is going to be a lot less, yet we have infinite detail. And I've priced that a lot in this tutorial, and I think that's a really valuable thing to take note of. So, the first example, I'm just going to switch up our scene a little bit here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of switch up the composition a little bit. I'm going to attempt to use this as a diffuse material. So I'm going to make the sphere a lot bigger. I'll maybe do like 250. And I'll just move him down a little bit. Maybe not 250, maybe 200. I'm going to come in with the camera. And inside this material here, I'm going to make him white. And we're just going to have a nice clean white sphere. Make sure that material is on the sphere, of course. And earlier on I mentioned how we can use this in the diffuse. And you also heard me mention the devil is in the details. In 3D, it's kind of like in art, in traditional art with painting. Typically the most detail is going to be when you hint at detail. So ever so slightly hinting at detail and not actually completely refining your strokes is what's going to emulate to the eye excessive levels of detail. And the same applies in 3D. A little detail applies to more detail. No detail applies to no detail. And I hope that makes sense. So what we do is we use noise to give slight corruption to the whiteness of the sphere to give off a much more realistic appearance. We take the noise and we give it a slight touchability to the surface of the sphere to give it a much more realistic and professional appearance. So I'll show that. So what we can do is we can put this in the diffuse, and we can solo the node, and we can scale them up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up our octaves and our omega. I'm going to bring up the gamma. I'm going to bring up the contrast. And I think something like this suits for now. If I can move that, that would be nice. Okay, I'll move this. And we'll just pop on a gradient here. And I'm just going to make this a kind of like a grey. If that. Just something a little bit darker than white. As you can see there, what's going on here is we're getting off coloring in some fashion. In fact, we could even leave it black, and we could use the gamma to completely control everything. So I'll just actually unplug the diffuser, the gradient right now, and I'll maybe bring up the octaves, and I'll bring up the omega almost to the max, and I'm going to bring up the scale of the transform. Like I said, we're just playing with this to the point we're hinting at the corruption of the sphere being off-colored. You can make that even bigger. The detail will not be affected. And you get to a point now where the sphere is off-colored, and at a distance we are hinting at an immense level of detail that isn't actually present, especially if we even come to a slightly lower value there, and we can see that. And now, to add some more conjecture, we can reset everything here and plug this into the bump, give it a transform and projection, set the box, scale it down all the way, keep going with it. And now you have this touchability to it, as you can see there. And if you bring down the gamma, so it's there, but it's there at the same frequency that the diffuse material is, as bumping up the bump too much could completely knock that off. We now have a sphere that looks a lot more professional than leaving it blank. And I think that's a very, very valuable thing to understand. And if I do that, and then delete this, you can see the difference in a professional, ever so slightly textured sphere that has a slight imperfection and a slight bump to it compared to your completely clean sphere. And uses like this for noise is what's going to be the artifice that takes your renders to the next level. So that'll conclude this segment, and next we'll move on to utilizing noise as a mask between two materials. Okay, so taking material 3 here, and I've duplicated it, I'm going to show you the effects of utilizing a noise texture as a mask. And the way we can do this is to differentiate between two different materials, as I kind of showed you putting it into the diffuse. You can use a gradient. We're kind of doing that one step up, where instead of just changing the color of one side of the noise, we can change the whole material. So you could have one side wood, and you could have one side marble, and the noise is differentiating them. And I think understanding, being able to use a primitive and a mathematical primitive like a noise, again, is a very valuable tool to have to your day-to-day workflow, to allow you to get complex and to understand complex nodes and materials faster. And you see, to begin with, what we can do here is with our mixed material applied. In the first material, we can see this one's quite glossy, and we can emphasize that, and I'll maybe lean him into the glossy side more. And now with the second material, I'm going to put in the same roughness, but I'm going to use a second bump, and I'm just going to put him in material 1, and I'm going to make him a lot more rough. And we're going to emphasize that as much as we can here, without going into that grain I mentioned earlier, but while making him a lot more rough around the edges and a lot more like dry concrete. Whereas in this first material, I'm going to lean a lot into that glossiness. And now if we were to take our initial bump, make sure they're in material 1 and 2, and plug this into the amount, we now have a controller. And if we were to bring this to Perlin and use the gamma, we can now control between the two. And to kind of put on a lot of contrast, you can see the effects of what's going on here. Now it may be smart to put in a transform and projection and scale that way up. But then as we start to creep in some of these octaves and some of that omega, and then play with the gamma, we can functionally control which is dry and which is reflective. And you see we can lean into this even more with how we use the reflective bump or the dry bump. And you can just kind of see the limits here. And we could have mere tiny parts peeking through in a reflective level. And you can see here with this effect, I've choked out just to the point where the reflections are more or less showing the surface imperfections that they're providing. And to push the boundaries of this, you could take the noise and put it into the more kind of dry rock and plug that into the bump there and play with your gamma. And now the parts that are roughening up on the reflections are going to protrude. And again, that's a very interesting effect. As an example, now using the roughness, the bump in all of these channels is going to be what's going to get you different levels and hinting at different details that you could potentially do. And plugging this noise into the roughness this time and then playing with the gamma can give you gaps. Well, of course we would want to change this back to an SUV because the sphere hates the sphere hates the box UVing. But we can see now we're kind of getting that puddle effect. And the more we play with this and the contrast, the more that comes to life. And for the most part, this trick is something I have used in a lot of my tutorials, and you may have seen me do it, but coming back to explain this and add the structure to it so you understand the components of what makes it work is what's going to allow you to not just use it in creating a render I guide you through, but to use it in all your renders. And knowing you can rely in turn to a noise in any scenario when you may not be able to create the asset in Photoshop that would allow you to create puddles, or you can do it procedurally. And procedurally, for the most part, is generally going to be better and faster, and it's going to look better than any texture you could make in Photoshop anyway. So I hope that helps you understand how to use noises as masks and have fun experimenting with that. One last thing I wanted to discuss, just as I kind of play around here, is the art of experimentation with something like this. And there's not really any kind of prior condition to something as random as a noise. And you can't really ever go into it predicting your exact result. It's going to do a lot of the work for you in some sense. And again, what we're trying to do here is hint at detail and hint at the likeness of something existing in 3D space. And by no means is a more realistic render better, but detail is never something to be overlooked in your work. And don't get that mixed up with perfectionism, because they are certainly two different things. And again, there is settings here. We've got circular and chips, and I think circular is one specifically which is good for those kind of realistic textures in your leathers. And kind of getting to grips with something like that, you can kind of see the very leather pattern running through it here, and we can really emulate a lot of different kind of looks, and we've still kind of got this off-whiteness going through it here. And if we were to come back to the gradient, we can emphasize the blacks, and again I could bring that, so now we're getting an off-white of blacks. And maybe I want to put this in the roughness and then put a gradient on that and play with this until I start to get a kind of sparkle on the height of the leather marks. And if I bring the white back down and bring the black over, we can kind of get a nice split between the two. Maybe we'll just leave it black for now. And typically whenever I'm doing kind of a studio environment shots, I use a lot of textures like this, so I have kind of that infinite mathematical control, and I think that's definitely something that's valuable. Again, if you're doing product renders and you're looking at products, when I look around my desk right now, I look at my keyboard and it kind of has a grain touchability to it, or I look at the dial that controls my speakers or my mouse mat, and they all kind of resemble that hint of detail that if you were to apply in a render would take your render to that next level without it needing to be the exact texture. Because realistically, when can you take a photo of parts of a keyboard to create the bump map that is between the keys? And using this on backgrounds as well is also something I became quite accustomed to doing, to again giving that feel of a slight discoloration going on. And if you were to scale that up, maybe just make sure it's not too uneven, kind of gives it a bit of a photo booth vibe. But again, just achieving that discoloration with the noise can give you a much more realistic look. So here is just an example where I have put these to use, and I want to show you this. And we have 3 objects in the scene here. Sorry for the slightly messy scene, but they're all kind of showing a lot of realism, and these kind of 3 center objects are looking quite real. There's no textures on them. This is all noise. And you can see again this discoloration down here. And you can see where I've used the roughness and the bump of the noise. And that some of this is geometry from my rock pack. Go check that out. And a lot of it is geometry, and you can see that there. But the reflections, well, that is the noise. You can see there's just 2 noises. And if I'm to take these off, the effect soon dissipates. And again, if I'm to unplug the noises from the spheres, we seem to begin to lose our look. And yes, I could bring up the roughness on either of these, but the effect is never quite the same. As you can see, when I plug those in there to the rock, it gives it a slight kind of sparkle intensity that when it's not plugged in is just not quite there. And again, using these 3 noises between the bump, roughness, and diffuse gives you that hint at realism that isn't quite there, but is abstract and detailed and professional. So with that, experiment and see what uses for it can fit in to your everyday projects. I just want to kind of elaborate on my final thoughts around noise. There's a lot more I would have liked to discuss in the tutorial, and there's a lot of things I felt I've missed out on. When I mentioned earlier about creating a flowchart of noises to compile into one noise to then create some kind of really intense surface imperfection, of course we can mess with the transform to turn the noise into lines, and you mix them with other noises and break them up and mask them, and you could get scratches and all sorts. I definitely might consider making a course on procedural textures in Octane. Now, of course, I will create one more texture as I'm talking here and finishing this up. And one thing you may have noticed me mention a few times today is curves, diminishing returns curves. And I think it's valuable. I read about it recently in a book, Digital Minimalism. And he speaks about the height of diminishing returns. And I think applying that to your art is immensely valuable. And even to extract that from something like the gamma attribute understanding that there is a point in which you are getting the highest amount of satisfactional returns for the highest amount of happiness and effort put into it. So I think that's where noise can be immensely valuable at relieving you of a lot of stress. And, you know, detail is not a linear value by any stretch. I think programming yourself to learn how to use noise and kind of putting your mind in a state where you resolve the problem this way instead of just attaching an image is going to be very, very valuable to you. So one last thing, I'm going to switch this back to white. Now, bring up the scale a little bit. Of course, it's a little bit harder to see the detail, but I'm going to come back to Perlin. I'm just going to take a look at that very basic just level of detail there. It's just something really nice to look at. And you can see as we start bringing up the contrast, we start dipping in the other way. And it looks awesome. And you gotta remember, your omega is only going to work as far as your octaves do. And the details truly are endless. If we are to switch to turbulence, you can get that much more geometric pattern. You can see here, this looks like, you know, I forgot what it's called, but the patterns there for blind people, the kind of even sci-fi effects we can get from this. It's really just something to be played with a lot. And I'll maybe dip back to black. I'll just show you one more example of using this with the roughness channel. You can see as soon as we plug that into the roughness, the noise is corresponding to it as if your typical surface imperfection, your grayscale information. And even if we're just to invert that, I mean, right now, what we've got is the parts not affected by the noise, which is just the surface of the sphere at your glossy level. And then we've got the parts that are noisy, rough. Now I think it's a lot cooler to invert that. So now the bits coming out are the ones glossy. And you can see something like that gives you the kind of fabric-like texture I mentioned. And also remembering that the more detail isn't always better. Sometimes bringing down the omega to get a bit more clarity on what you're looking at can really add to the functionality of whatever texture you're trying to perceive. And as I mentioned before about turning things into lines, you can immediately get textures that can be used in all different fashions. I did feel like after my noise tutorial last year, which I came back to making tutorials with, has now become outdated due to Octane 2020. So elaborating on noises and the history of noises in this tutorial seems very appropriate. And thank you for watching the tutorial. You can check out my assets on my store. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring yet another tutorial. And I think if you do struggle with the precision or direction of Octane noises, then I will make sure to put up a product on the store that has these set up and ready for you, as they can be tricky to get used to, and they can be overwhelming, but I definitely think there's a lot of value in attempting to find your own result and find what scene suits this result and play around with it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon in the next tutorial.